So in this lecture, we're going to talk about aesthetics. And when you think of aesthetics, I want you to think about directing the eye. We're directing the attention of the viewer throughout the image. Now, you know this in terms of graphic design, how you can do things like creating contrast or hierarchy to direct the viewer throughout the design. Well, the same thing applies to photography. And why this is important is because when you're incorporating photography into your design, you also want the viewer to be able to navigate through the photography itself. So I want to start off this lecture by showing you guys a music video from Sigur Rós. This is an Icelandic group. And as you're watching this, I want you to think about the ways that the cinematographer is directing the eye. One of the primary roles of a photographer is to be able to take a scene and to organize it in a way that allows the viewer to easily navigate through the image. And one of the ways we do that is through framing. I think of it as organizing the chaos. Framing is something that happens when you're taking a photograph, but it's also something that happens when you're working with a photograph that someone else has taken and you're using the crop tool. You're deciding what gets put inside of that frame. In order to frame, you first have to determine what are you trying to communicate? What does the viewer need to understand about this scene? So here we have two photographs. On the left, we have a wide shot. On the right, we have a close-up shot. It is the same exact scene, but you can see by the framing of it, the differences in the context. This could be interpreted in a number of different ways. Maybe he's deep in contemplation on the right, and on the left, maybe it's about relaxing in nature. But you can see that there's really two messages that are being articulated here based on the framing of the image. So when you're framing a shot and you're deciding what to include in the frame, whether it's taking the photograph or using the crop tool in Photoshop, you should ask yourself these questions. What do you want to communicate? How do you want to communicate it? How do you want the audience to feel about the subject? Do you want to accentuate or diminish the subject? What should you prioritize? And how will the viewer be directed? So let's look at the very first shot of the Sigur Rós video. You can see it starts out in a wide shot. The director has decided to include a lot more of the environment. In terms of screen real estate, we can see that the ocean occupies a majority of the frame. The director is setting the stage, establishing the environment. The scene is about conveying a sense of solitude, perhaps melancholy, perhaps a sense of isolation. And there's also a lot of mystery in the shot and the way the shot is framed. It's very minimalistic. There's nothing superfluous in the shot, and it leaves you wondering what is outside of the frame. We can see the director holds on this shot for quite a bit and is arousing the curiosity of the viewer. And this also bookends the very end of the music video. We start with a shot of the sea and we end with a shot of the sea. And you'll notice about midway through the music video, remember it changes to this, and this is such a stark contrast between the opening shot, which the first half of the video was all blue cast, and now suddenly we have this gold cast on everything. And again, we look at the framing of the shot. You'll notice how small they are in respect to the environment. And the framing in this shot articulates the landscape dominating the subjects, emphasizing the vastness of the environment and also the long journey ahead. And you can see that in the placement of the subjects on the very edge of the left side of the frame. You can see it is indeed a very long journey and they have just so much further to go. When we wish to prioritize the importance of the subject over the environment, we can choose to use a close-up shot. We can do this either in our cameras or by using the crop tool. Quite often this is done to create a feeling of intimacy, or it can have the opposite effect, a feeling of claustrophobia. So when you're taking a photograph of a person or you're cropping an image of a person, something to consider is a rule of thumb known as cutting heights. And under this framing rule, you want to avoid putting the edge of the frame on a person's natural joint. That could be their neck, their waist, their ankle. You want it to be either above or below that area. And this relates to the Gestalt law of closure that suggests that we tend to complete an incomplete shape to rationalize the whole. So this is another reason why when we're deciding on a crop area, we want to leave a suggestion of continuation. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. You can see the image on the right, it's cutting directly through her neck. And the image on the left, it gives us additional context. We know that there is a body that's attached to this head. And by including that area just below the neck, it also provides additional closure. Here's another example. We have the edge of the frame cutting directly across her knees, and she might have legs, she might not. We can't really tell. And to fix that, all you need to do is loosen up the frame within the camera or the crop, so you have just a little bit more context. And again, we can go either below or above. So framing is determined by a number of different factors. We have camera angle, the camera placement, The depth of field, that is what is in focus and what is out of focus in this shot. We also have focal length and composition. And again, framing is all about what do you want to reveal or conceal. Where the camera is put in relation to the subject is important, whether the camera is below the subject, level with the subject, or above the subject. In this photograph, the camera is placed below the bust to give it the appearance of being more dominant or possibly more powerful. The bird's eye view is a common perspective that you see a lot in motion pictures and also photography. It's often used as an establishing shot in motion pictures to describe the geography of an environment, and it can also be used to convey feelings of futility. The bird's eye view is used quite a bit in cinema, and here's a few examples. So in regards to camera placement, if we put the camera below the subject, that gives us a low angle. And quite often this is used to make the subject appear more dominant, more powerful. This angle is used quite a bit in action movies. It can also make the subject appear aggressive or even threatening. So this is a screenshot from Inglourious Basterds. This is a Quentin Tarantino movie. And here you can see that the two subjects are obviously very dominant. The camera is placed below the subjects. The cinematographer is obviously trying to convey a sense of dominance with the subjects, but also the opposite effect with the audience viewpoint. You can see because we're in a lower position, it makes us feel inferior and submissive. So eye level is something that you see quite a bit in news media. It's a very neutral angle and it's free of emotion. It's really not articulating anything. It's a very safe angle, and it's the least interesting in terms of composition. This is also kind of our view. We see things from eye level. A high angle shot is where the camera is positioned from above. It tends to subordinate the subject, makes them look weak and submissive, and it may also articulate emotions of fear, confusion, and panic. So whether the camera is tilted or level, this also has an impact on the feel of the image. If we have a level horizon, this tends to emphasize stability, conservatism, reliability. This is used quite a bit in architectural photography. And if we had taken this image with the camera tilted and we wanted to convey a sense of stability, then we could just use our crop tool to rotate it and level the horizon. So a canted angle is also called a Dutch angle, and this happens when you either tilt the camera or rotate the crop to create more of a diagonal orientation. And this is used to emphasize energy, activity, and progress. You see this angle used quite a bit in car commercials and sports advertisements, even in food photography. If you have something that's relatively mundane, you can make it more visually interesting by canting the angle. Creating areas of sharpness within an image is another way that we can direct the eye, and we can either do this in the camera or within Photoshop. Depth of field is what is in focus within an image. This is an example of what that looks like. So depth of field, think of it as the zone of acceptable focus in the field of view. This is an example of a very shallow depth of field, and this is an example of a wide depth of field. So in this image, what is the first thing you see? I would guess that most of you would say the rocks, and here we're using a shallow depth of field to direct the viewer's attention. So composition, this is something that you should be fairly familiar with. Composition is the arrangement of visual elements within the frame. The objectives of composition are to direct the attention, simulate depth, and also visual organization. Arguably one of the most important components of a strong composition is having a clear focal point. A focal point is essential to directing the eye, and without it, the viewer doesn't know where to look and loses interest. Color is also important when we're talking about directing the eye. The human eyes are attracted to complementary colors. In this image, what's the first thing you see? Well, most likely the first thing you see are her eyes, because not only do you have contrast, but you also have complementary colors. Using contrast is the most effective way to create a focal point. And you can see in this painting here of the Last Supper, the windows offer the highest amount of contrast. And we can also see in this painting, Leonardo uses the architecture within the painting to create leading lines, drawing us back to the focal point. So when you're capturing an image or you're processing an image in Photoshop, and you're thinking about how the viewer is going to navigate through the image, here are some key things you should consider. When viewing an image, the eye will be drawn to something that's higher before lower, larger before smaller. We tend to look at the front of an object before the back of the object, brighter before darker, and the eye is drawn to objects that are in focus before objects that are out of focus. So another way that we can direct the eye is by using the rule of thirds. And this is a theory that if you place points of interest at the intersections or along the lines of the rule of thirds, that your photo becomes more balanced and it enables the viewer to interact with the image more naturally. And this rule of composition essentially divides the frame up into 9 equal areas, and it's a guide for positioning the point of interest along an intersection or line. The eyes are a natural point of interest. Quite often, the eyes are put on that upper line in the rule of thirds, that upper third line. So the rule of thirds is not a new phenomenon. It's been used by artists throughout the centuries. Here we have an example. This is The Great Wave painting by Hokusai. So a key to good composition, keep it simple, have a dominant focal point. There should be a logical progression or hierarchy, and there shouldn't be any ambiguity in there. And composition is not just about what you see, but it's also what you don't see. So factor in the impact of negative space. Let's talk about vectors. This is also known as leading lines. And basically it's a directional force that directs the viewer's focus to something on or off the screen. Vectors can be created in a number of different ways. Here we have an example of an index vector. And in this shot, what the actors are looking at is creating the leading lines that are leading our eyes throughout the image. Here's another example of index vectors. There's also graphic vectors, and graphic vectors are created by things within the environment, such as architecture or a landscape, interior walls, roads or streets, perhaps even a street sign could create a graphic vector. There's also motion vectors that are created by objects in motion. There's also something called magnetism of the frame, and this is the theory from Gestalt psychology, which suggests that a frame has powers of attraction, and objects placed close to an edge, either inside or outside the frame, will be perceived as drawn toward the frame. This is a screenshot from a Alfred Hitchcock film, and you can see here the director is choosing to frame this in a way uses that magnetism of the frame to create more of a separation between these two characters. And you can see the characters are being pulled apart. When you're taking a photograph or cropping an image, something to consider, especially when you're dealing with faces, is to allow an adequate amount of headroom. Image on the right falls closer into that better composition using the rule of thirds, and it has a good amount of headroom. You want some space, but not too much. Again, headroom is the space between the top of the person's head and the top of the frame. When considering headroom, you want to leave just enough to neutralize that magnetic pull of the upper screen edge. So in Photoshop, we can use this concept of magnetism of the frame to accentuate or add drama to an image. Here we have a shot of a rock climber. If we want to emphasize the height, we can recrop the image, putting the climber at the top edge of the frame. We're using magnetism of the frame with the image on the right to accentuate the height of the mountain. Aesthetics in practice, again, when we're either taking the photograph ourselves or processing images in Photoshop, we want to be cognizant of these aesthetic principles: vectors, graphic, index, motion, rule of thirds, camera placement, camera angle, and depth of field.